For a great deal of American history, African Americans had endured deep racial prejudice and deprivation of their rights. Although slavery was an institution of the past, racial tensions continued, particularly in the Deep South, causing local governments to adopt laws violating basic civil rights based on race.
I have 2 daughters and 2 sons, and if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out. I'm not thinking I don't want her associating with colored people, period.
Known as Jim Crow laws, they fostered discrimination towards African Americans. The 1896 case, Plessy v. Ferguson, gave legal basis for such laws under the pretext that all accommodations were separate but equal. Southern public institutions were then able to operate within the law while segregating, despite the lack of instances where equal provisions were truly provided. Due to many influencing factors, African Americans began to fight the many injustices they faced, including the segregation of schools.
But God said He created all men equal, all men alike. And so therefore, none of us stands above the other person in God's sight.
From the 1940s to the late 1960s, the issue of segregated schools became a major point of controversy in the United States as African Americans were no longer satisfied by the idea of separate but equal society and the separation that robbed them of their rights and divided the two racial communities. Although the Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson, did not directly address education, its separate but equal doctrine was used to its fullest extent in order to justify school segregation. During the first half of the 20th century, Southern school states were officially and rigidly segregated. Under the pretext that schools were separate but equal, black students attended different schools than white students, despite the glaring gap between the quality of their educations. Southern states spent 50% more per student in white schools. Buildings, books, equipment, and teacher salaries suffered due to lack of funding in black schools, and the disparity grew larger over the next several decades. Civil rights organizations such as the NAACP fought against collegiate discrimination through the judicial system. Thurgood Marshall argued on behalf of black students who were rejected from white universities but had no equal African American colleges in place to uphold the separate but equal notion. By winning these cases, he not only provided admission into white schools for blacks, but more importantly, strengthened Marshall's resolve to fight segregation in education.
That case is one where the court feeling bound by Plessy's doctrine that separation was permissible so long as the races separated had equal benefits. Applying that separate but equal doctrine, they wanted to address Missouri's exclusionary practices. And essentially the case found that under that doctrine, the state of Missouri had an obligation to provide for blacks an equal legal education as they provided for whites.
In 1954, 5 cases regarding the constitutionality of segregated schools merged into one under the name Brown v. Board of Education. The case originated with Oliver Brown, who accused the school district of Topeka, Kansas, of violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment for the unforgivable difference in quality between black and white schools. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of gradual, flexible approach to desegregating schools of the South instead of immediate and forceful action. School officials were left to freely interpret what the court deemed a prompt and reasonable start to integration, with no deadline in sight for them to adhere to. Schools were allowed to delay plans for desegregation in several ways, including citing local issues, which was deemed a reasonable cause by the court. This set the pretext for school officials to arbitrarily decide to hold off on integration and for fervent segregationists to intervene and prevent desegregation in the Upper South.
People of Virginia will receive the opinion of the Supreme Court calmly and take time to carefully and dispassionately consider the situation before coming to conclusions on steps which should be taken. I hope all will cooperate to afford this opportunity for the careful development of a program which will be in the best interests of the entire citizenship.
after the Brown v. Board decision was made by the Supreme Court, 2 schools in Upper Arkansas desegregated due to legal obligation, financial reasons, and moral reasoning. In 1954, Fayetteville became the first formerly Confederate county to officially desegregate. The school was careful to limit publicity of its actions, fearing retaliation from overzealous segregationists who would disrupt the calm transitions taking place. Fayetteville's small population of African Americans regularly interacted with whites, making the town more prepared than others to integrate. However, the success of Brown v. Board was short-lived as national media coverage of certain schools' integration brought segregationist groups from all over the country to these areas, causing chaos to erupt with violent protests. Their inflammatory actions incited local citizens to join the protest against integration in their respective counties, such as in Little Rock, Arkansas. Problems began to arise across districts in Arkansas, even among those which had previous success with integration. Fayetteville experienced a delay in segregating all grade levels, neglecting to integrate elementary school grades until federal law mandated.
We just got a report here on this end that the students are in. Turn the kids down that way, down there. You can see from here some of the action occurring down there.
During the late 1950s, only 6 school districts had any form of success with integration, and by 1963, the number had risen to only 13. However, in 1956, Montgomery buses began to integrate. In 1957, President Eisenhower called for troops to protect black students integrating white schools. In 1960, black students began to sit at white lunch counters, and finally, in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the first major federal legislation providing full rights to citizens of all races by prohibiting all forms of discrimination based on race, religion, gender, or origin. With its authoritative and immediate mandate for desegregation, it had significant impact on all Southern schools lagging in the integration process. By leaving the states to their own devices to decide how to implement desegregation, the court had allowed defiance and widespread resistance in the South.
All over the United States, every night was election night, and every night people in the United States watched the news, and every night they made up their minds. And as they made up their minds, they forced the Congress of the United States to confront the issue, make up its mind, and pass the Civil Rights Bill.
The passage of the act enforced the negation of Plessy v. Ferguson, which allowed for segregation and discrimination under the separate but equal ruling. The Civil Rights Act also took away the lenience that the Brown v. Board decision gave and prohibited schools from postponing integration. African Americans of the 20th century fought hard to attain their civil rights, including the right to a fair and equal education. The case of Brown v. Board began school desegregation and was a major victory in the battle for equal educational rights for African Americans. Despite some setbacks in the integration effort, the case decision succeeded in setting the precedent for firm legislation in the form of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ordered a swift and immediate desegregation of schools across the country. It was a breakthrough in the fight to acquire basic civil liberties, providing African Americans with the legal right to the education that they had long sought after, and this was a considerable triumph for the civil rights activists.